Hi, this is Paul. Often, Sam Harris, I think it's Sam Harris, if I'm wrong, you'll correct me in the comment section, will say things like, atheists just don't believe in God. That's all there is to atheism. That's just it. They just don't believe there is a God or believe in God. And even though believe there is a God and believe in God are really not exactly the same thing. But then, of course, then some of them go on to denounce religion. But defining religion is actually an incredibly difficult thing, as we've been playing with this on the channel. Now, what do you mean by religion? And in the past, I've defined two aspects of religion. Religion S, which is sort of the secularized definition of religion, which is what Sam Harris is usually talking about. It'll have elements of the supernatural, belief in the Bible, usually things that can sort of group together groups that Sam Harris finds problematic. Christians, of course, Sam Harris got a big piece of his rise in the wake of 9/11. So a lot of those types of things. Now, I've been talking about civil religion, Christian nationalism, and in my video on Christian nationalism, someone plucked up Judy Garland sings the Battle Hymn of the Republic in the wake of the JFK shootings. Fascinating. Of course, she just sings the song as Judy Garland does. Judy Garland, there was a biopic about her fairly recently, which I watched, and I watched with quite a bit of interest. I really didn't know much about her. Most of what I had seen from her was from Follow the Yellow Brick Road and The Wizard of Oz. Of course, she famously went on to have quite a career, but a lot of ups and downs, which the biopic went into. And there is plenty of material about Judy Garland on YouTube. Now, it's very interesting. In 1963, after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, she sings this rendition with so much gusto and sings about God. And in some ways, if you look at some of the elements of civil religion that I dealt with in my video where I read George Marsden's Fundamentalism in American Culture, it's all sort of there symbolically. And by listening to Judy Garland, you can get a sense of how deep this is in American culture. And many times I've said that the American culture war is a Christendom civil war in American culture. And I've got some more elements of George Marsden's book that I'm going to be reading in the future, I anticipate. But you can see, even in just this case of Judy Garland, elements of folk religion. She became a gay rights icon, and that came through very strongly in the biopic, of course. Women's empowerment, but at the same time, a legacy of abuse. She was a child star. Child stars are routinely abused, not just sexually, but in just about every way a child can be abused, which is why I would never want any of my children to work for Hollywood, frankly. But substance abuse, Me Too, and the biopic brings this out. But there's lots and lots of material on Judy Garland out there. Fascinating figure. But again, just listen to her sing that song and understanding the context in which she's singing it. And you can get a tangible sense of, well, civil religion in America, of Christian nationalism, and how to sort of point it out to one side. Well, who's Christianity? So tracking Christian nationalism is an interesting thing. And again, the last video that I posted Monday morning, it was posted on fundamentalism in American culture. And then the video that I posted last week, how the civil rights great awakening created the religion that denies it's a religion. And that was just a fascinating article in Pathos about how the civil rights movement converted white Protestants to secularism. And so this is, in some ways, it's this kind of thing that this channel has been hunting all along. Now, I also caught over the weekend, or I think I caught it end of last week, Bill Maher's. It's, little segments of Bill Maher. And I've watched Bill Maher forever. I really enjoyed his show, Politically Incorrect. I still enjoy listening to him. as anyone who watches my channel should understand, I don't just enjoy listening to people who agree with me. And Bill Maher is Bill Maher. It's exactly who he is. He's the guy who did an entire $7.5 million movie called Ridiculous. And he regularly mocks organized or formal religion, yet the imagination that we can somehow not be religious simply by not believing in God or not reading the Bible or not going to church or imagining and defining religion to be, well, things about the supernatural and gods and these kinds of things is frankly ridiculous. And you can see it on both sides. And so Bill Maher notes the pro-Trump demonstrations that stormed the Capitol, and this is what's getting all the airplay on Christian nationalism right now. But again, anyone with any sense of history, it's written, it's there in plain sight. So here on the right, in the wake of the George Floyd killing, all of this religious iconography, adapted religious, here we're kneeling, here we've got our arms in the air, here we're practicing repentance. Now kneeling with a fist in the air, talk about, I mean, you don't have to go to Jonathan Peugeot's channel to look at the dissonance in that, because what is, people, I've never actually watched Game of Thrones, but via Game of Thrones, to bend the knee comes into the culture. So we're both going to bend the knee and put our fist in the air. And it's like, do you understand the liturgy? Do you understand the drama? Do you understand the symbolism? Do you understand how you are trying to say two things at once and how incredibly important you saying two things at once? But here you are, where are you performing this religious, anyone throughout Christendom history would see this bending, or perhaps all around the world, this kneeling as a religious act, and you're doing it on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Now, should we be calling it the Lincoln Memorial, or should we be calling it the Lincoln Temple? Now, again, someone recently sent me an article from San Francisco where they want to get Abraham Lincoln and George Washington off of the names of some of the schools in San Francisco. But this is exactly why you build monuments too big to destroy. That's why size and monumentality matters. So you've got the George Washington Memorial, and right there they all are in the reflection pool, which obviously magnifies the monumentation. So you've got between the George Washington Memorial and the Lincoln Memorial, or shall we call it a temple? Because if you walk in, what does the building call itself? In this temple is the Lincoln Memorial religious? Anyone who has an understanding of, well, I've often said that if you would drop someone from the ancient world into this area of Washington, D.C., they would look around and imagine they're looking at the Acropolis of Washington, D.C. These are the temples. George Washington on that throne is basically the statue of Zeus. And just read what it says. In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. Now listen to Judy Garland sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Christian nationalism is new. Christian nationalism is a new thing. Oh, we're going to get rid of this because we're going to get rid of religion. Well, if you get rid of religion, then storming the Capitol is just another sightseeing tour, because the difference between those people coming in the day before with a tour and the people storming in many ways, is a religious difference. Oh, it's a political difference. Yeah, politics is now and religion is always. And so what we saw basically in that article on how the civil rights movement converted white liberals, Protestants to secularism, is that there's a difference in the mediating institution of the religion at play. American Constitution, at least in the Bill of Rights, there's no establishment of a federal state church. But at the time that the Bill of Rights was passed, there were a number of established churches in various states within the American United States. And in fact, the last of those established churches in blue state Massachusetts went away in the 1830s. What does that mean? God is not mentioned in the Constitution, but God comes in for some heavy lifting in the Declaration of Independence. And this heavy lifting, in fact, one of the beauties about having a YouTube channel is that some of you, especially on Twitter, send me tweets that are germane to the conversation. And so February 6th, Eric Weinstein. This is the point. He's responding to a Dave Rubin chat. Now, a Dave Rubin tweet. Now, if you know some of the stuff that I've said about Dave Rubin in the past, what's been amazing about the transformation of Dave Rubin is that he has gone from left-wing, gay, young Turk to basically a Cold War activist arm in arm with someone like Dennis Prager. Now, Dennis Prager, in my view, is basically a holdover from the Cold War. If you're old enough to remember the 1960s and the 1970s in America, a lot of the stuff that you hear from someone like Dennis Prager is pretty common of what you'd hear from a certain side of the political matrix in the 1970s and 1980s. It's just basically a continuation of the Cold War. But now, Eric Weinstein's tweet I found to be fascinating. First, I'll read Dave Rubin's thread. I've come to the conclusion that the collapse we are in now is the inevitable end of what purely secular liberalism looks like. A sad reality as someone who wrote a book defending liberalism. The tolerance baked into liberalism is what let wokeness into the system. Eric Weinstein then responds to that tweet. This is a point I have also made in different forms. We hold these truths to be self-evident, all caps, all caps. Men are endowed by their creator, all caps, with certain unalienable rights, unalienable in all caps. You can complain all you want, but those words are load-bearing. And Weinstein's right. That's partly why this atheist says prayers. How atheist is he? What does it mean to be an atheist? Now, my response to the person that sent me this tweet, who follows both of us on Twitter, my response was, I'm not sure he will go anywhere with it beyond where he's been. He seems to like to regularly walk to the edge of the high dive and recommend the view, but is hesitant to jump. Prayers notwithstanding. Atheist prayers notwithstanding. That or one of these bashful modernists that wants to keep it private. And thinking about Jordan Peterson, who wants to, well, you know, my private beliefs are my private beliefs. I'm not criticizing that move. I'm just making the point that that's a modernist move. That's what modernists do, because we have this secular religious duality that this is partly how we navigate the private and the public spheres. This is partly behind my video and my tweet. Nationalism is the methadone of true religion. America replaced a mediating form of Christianity in civil religious, what I'll call proto-evangelicalism. Now, in my evangelicalism, I just recently heard someone call themselves an evangelical in some point, even though he's an atheist. And you know, language has that kind of flexibility and that resonance. Neo-evangelicalism, which is really the evangelicalism that we find today, that was sort of relaunched by Billy Graham in the middle of the 20th century, really as a way to sort of differentiate themselves from the main line. And it was a way to sort of update and upgrade what had been in the early 20th century fundamentalism, but now with a little bit better conversation with what's going on in the broader society. That's really neo-evangelicalism, and you can read Mary Worthen's excellent book on the history of that movement. It's really a terrific book. So neo-evangelicalism, I often comment, is really more of a marketplace than a church. It's not a denomination. Does it have an ecclesiology? It's certainly not the Roman Catholic Church. Roman Catholic Church isn't technically a denomination, but in the United States it sort of functions as one. And this sort of gets at Sally's comment about being Protestant. It's very difficult to be a Christian in consumer America and not be sort of swept into Protestantism, at least in a performative way. But this civil religion, complete with temples in Washington, D.C., that call themselves temples, and again, well, let me do a little quick exploring. Okay, the Lincoln Memorial is a U.S. national memorial built to honor the 16th President of the United States at the west end of the National Mall. The memorial's architect was Henry Bacon. The designer of this memorial interior's central statue, Abe Lincoln, 1920, was Daniel Chester French. The Lincoln statue was carved by the Piccirilli brothers. The painters of the interior mural was dedicated in May 1922. Is this Christian nationalism, or is this civil religion? But you do know that Abraham Lincoln, who died to set us free, died on Good Friday. You know, for a long time, historians have noted that in terms of American civil religion, Lincoln is the Christ figure. Endowed by their creator with inalienable rights, is load-bearing. Now, again, I want to reference one of my favorite Tom Holland videos, which is a recording of a talk that he gave, Did Religion Exist in the Ancient World? Now, again, if you ask these young people that are bowing before the Jesus Christ of American history, Abraham Lincoln, if they are performing a religious act, I expect there would be a little bit of disagreement. Tom Holland's point is that, well, when the Greeks did their sacrifices, when they constructed their temples, they weren't doing it in a self-consciously religious fashion according to any definition of religious secular. Secularism wasn't invented yet. It was not a category yet. And as Tom Holland has argued, and I've been persuaded, and increasingly, you know, someone sent me a woke tweet about it, secularism is a Christian construct. What on earth are we to do? Ask someone who keeps dismissing everything because they're social constructs whether morality is a social construct. Where will you be left to stand? D.C. is Temple Land, USA. Now, there are a couple, I thought, excellent conversations that Jordan Peterson took part in. The first one, I'm not going to do the second one today, but the one with Mark Ridley I thought was also, I think that's his name, Mark Ridley. I thought that was also fascinating. Both of them interesting. And actually, I thought Mikhaila's presence in this conversation was very useful, because in the second conversation with Ridley, Jordan is obviously feeling stronger because he's taken up some of his old bad habits of not letting the person that he's there having a conversation with, he keeps slipping into teacher mode. And I actually toyed with the idea of making some clips of Jordan Peterson cutting him off and Jordan Peterson lecturing him on what really the point that the guest should be making. But that's just Jordan. And Jordan is just such a teacher that he just keeps teaching when you get him into a mode. And I completely understand that. I'm a preacher. You just keep preaching. But if the point here is that basically, if religion is always and politics is now, and And religion is not something that we just attach to God or supernatural things or something like this, but rather religion is part of how we go about life. Religion W rather than religion S. Well, Judy Garland was basically holding church there when she was singing this song. And Americans have been very religious, just like the ancient Greeks, whether they know it or not. And when we walk into the Lincoln Memorial and read, "In this temple," we don't even blink. No, that's not religious. We're using temple metaphorically. No, it's exactly the right word. And I would imagine, I don't know when that was carved, but I would imagine that they knew exactly what they were saying. Go into the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and look around at the statuary and the iconography. Look at, again, if you were to drop an ancient person into Temple Land, USA, which is the Capitol Mall in Washington, D.C., there it all is. This is why we build monuments. We communicate our religious impulses and we set them in stone so they're not easy to change. And whereas we've had mobs going around attacking statues, well, I don't think any time in the Biden administration we're going to be taking down the Jefferson Memorial or the Lincoln Memorial or the Washington Memorial. When you see those statues and those monuments come down, you know things have changed. It's going to be interesting to watch. And again, watch Jonathan Peugeot's video on statues. So those listening, I had never heard of Mark Manson before, nor read his books. Apparently 13 million people have bought them, and his books have gone out into just about every language group that they publish to. According to Jordan, I found this to be a fascinating conversation, especially within the realm of self-help. And again, I've likened Jordan Peterson to a preacher. And I think that is functionally how he has operated on the American stage. Yeah, he's got a day job as an academic. We could talk about the academy in terms of its relationship to church. But in many ways, self-help is sort of a folk religion. And it's a folk secular religion in terms of how it operates. And there's some really interesting elements to this conversation, not imposing a value structure. And Jordan calls him on it, and it's beautiful. So I'm gonna play some of the video and do some commentary. Now, again, my disclaimer on my video commentary. I'm not going to play the whole video, so if what I show you is a teaser, watch the whole video. If you get annoyed at me interrupting the video, it's because this is a commentary on the video. And if you want to watch the whole video, Jordan put a clip of it on his own channel. Apparently, he was quite satisfied with it. But if you want to watch the whole video, watch the whole video. It's all there on YouTube, the same place you're finding this. So my goal is not to reproduce the video. My goal is to comment on the video.
So a lot of this intellectual endeavor that you've been engaged in over the course of these last two books was reminiscent to me of what I was involved in when I was, I think, probably almost exactly your age. Maybe we started at about the same age, but you're investigating, as far as I can tell, the relationship between value structures and emotion. That seems to be your fundamental concern. Is that reasonable? And you made the conclusion that...
Yeah, I'd say that's accurate.
That your values determine your emotional states.
Generally speaking, yeah.
And then the question arises, what constitutes a valid value? And you investigate that even more thoroughly in your second book, relying on philosophers, for example, like Nietzsche and Kant. And so the question of what constitutes an acceptable value structure is an incredibly deep question, and maybe part of the reason that you're...
Now, I just want to make a note of a little bit of what's in this scene. Who is in the background? We've got Dirty Harry. I think just from the lower part might be James Dean. It's just fascinating. Well, how isn't that iconography of a certain sort? I would think so. And again, I'm not making a huge point. It's just, well, Hollywood has long been one of the mediators of American religion and American religious values. And so here Peterson is going right to the value thing. And of course, Sevilla King's channel, Quality Experience, is behind this, because Sevilla has been, one of, if we have our distribution of cognition, Sevilla's been the one that's been pursuing Persig and Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and that whole aspect of that, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, being one of the most popular philosophy books that we've had in the last 50 years in American culture. And so Peterson just nails, okay, you're talking about value systems and emotions. And Peterson saying, this is something that, where's my copy of Maps of Meaning? In many ways, that's what a lot of what Maps of Meaning is all about. Sorry, a little bit of housekeeping there.
Your books have been successful is because so many people are asking that question now. What?
Your books are successful because so many people are asking, they're asking questions of value systems. Why? Because we're in a religious transition. And I mean that. We're in a religious transition. Our value systems are being recalibrated, disrupted, intermediated, and this is what's causing a lot of anger and hostility and a lot of emotion. And if you look at, okay, well, why did Jordan Peterson hit a nerve? Well, if you understand how the world looks through the eyes of Jordan Peterson, and he in some ways was surprised at what has happened, in other ways not, because he understands the relationship between value systems and emotions, and these things, in fact, scale up.
What is an incredibly deep question, and maybe part of the reason. And so,
yep.
The question of what constitutes an acceptable value structure is an incredibly deep question, and maybe part of the reason that your books have been successful is because so many people are asking that question now. What?
I think so. Sorry. I'm.
I don't know if he's nervous or didn't have any sleep, or, but actually, he sort of is a little drowsy in the first part of the conversation, but he really picks up in the rest of the video. So again, I didn't know who Mark Manson was, and I thought, well, I've done all this investment into Jordan Peterson. I should at least give it a listen. Nobody really, promoted it my way. And then when I listened to it, I thought, there's a ton in this conversation, and Jordan looks good and sounds good. And in the next conversation with Ridley, he's even better.
Anticipating your question, which I assume is why is that?
Well, and what's it done for you? This investigation.
Well, that's an interesting question, because I've always seen my work, and my background is blogging. I don't have an academic background in this stuff like you do. But I started blogging in 2008, and initially I kind of used it as my own vehicle for personal development, growth, developing emotional intelligence, managing relationships, all these things. And so kind of the way my career has unspooled is whatever issue I'm kind of struggling with at that period of my life, I investigate it, and then I write about it, and the writing is kind of my own personal form of digestion, I suppose.
And, when I listened to this, I thought, well, you're doing exactly what I'm doing, but you did it more successfully. And then you wrote a book, and the book took off. And so beware to you who has success. But fascinating that, he's working out his own meaning crisis basically. And so he blogged, and again, millions of people are doing this. They're just doing this. Most of them have not written a best-selling book, okay? But he says, I'm not an academic. I was just working out my own stuff, and these are some of the things that he came to. And later on in the conversation Beyond What I'll Play, he writes, well, why the use of fuck so often in the book. And they'll talk about that. And again, the whole conversation was really excellent. And the conversation was definitely better for Mikhaila's participation in it. And I thought that was significant, especially because Jordan is Jordan. And so he's bringing in his really smart and helpful insights. But Mikhaila sort of brings in sort of the person on the street who became sort of a nice foil for Mark in this conversation. So actually, I was really pleased for the way this whole thing unfolded.
And I just kind of have this faith that if I'm going through it, then there must be a lot of other people going through it.
I have this faith
as well.
I actually
faith that if I'm going through it, then there must be a lot of other people going through it as well.
I actually think that's the answer to why your book was so successful, is that it is the case that there's a large population of people who have the same questions that you do, and are stumped in the same way that you are or were, and that you're leading them through a process of investigation and thought at exactly the level that's there's this idea from developmental psychology.
Now, he's about to say something that's really important, but I wanted to pause there because would our culture call this a religious conversation? Now we're going to we're going to talk about philosophy, because you can write eat, pray, love, and is it religious? Go back to my conversation with the book wave guys. And I made the comment that if you go into, let's say, a yoga studio, and you can have statuary from Hinduism, and you can start your session and your meditation with Om, but they will very quickly tell you, no, this isn't religious. And it's like, what on earth do we mean by this word? And self-help isn't religious. And you can see that this whole firewall between religion and secularity is just crumbling. And in fact, secularity was propped up by the religious structures underneath it, which is why Eric Weinstein says those sections in the Declaration of Independence that don't even have any weight as law, you don't promise to uphold the Declaration of Independence. You promise to uphold the Constitution, which doesn't have creator or God or anything in it. But all of this, Eric Weinstein, I think he's exactly right in there. This is load bearing. But what exactly are we working through here? Well, this isn't God or religion or church or any of that. Oh, okay. Well, it's values. Oh, okay. But you can have any values you want as long as you, keep it in a clean room, safe from religion. That's sort of the atheist argument, what they've been making.
Psychology, that leading them through a process of, in the same way that you are or were, and that you're leading them through a process of investigation and thought at exactly the level that's, there's this idea from developmental psychology that a man named Vygotsky originated called the zone of proximal development. And adults speak to infants and toddlers with implicit knowledge of the zone of proximal development.
Now, what's fascinating by that is when I heard that, I immediately translated into John Calvin's, this is God condescending. This is God basically figuring out how to talk to us as children. It's the same idea, the theological idea. And here we arrive at it through psychology centuries later.
And what they do in zone of proximal development. And adults speak to infants and toddlers with implicit knowledge of the zone of proximal development. And what they do is speak at a level that's slightly more advanced than the infant or toddler can understand. And that leads them, so they can mostly understand the adult speech, but not quite. And that leads them further, right? Right? They can understand, but they're also forced to develop further understanding. And what they do is speak at a level that's slightly more advanced than the infant or toddler can understand. And that leads them, so they can mostly understand the adult speech, but not quite. And that leads them further, right? They can understand, but they're also forced to develop further understanding. And I've noticed when I was teaching that it was often the case that when I was trying to figure out something out, that was the best time to teach it rather than after I had figured it out. Because then I would have forgot what the problem was and also what I didn't know.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think part of it is, this is kind of the hypothesis I lay out in the book, and it's something I still believe, but I think when you live in a society where information is no longer scarce, where there's essentially more stuff for you to consume and understand and learn about.
Okay, when you live in a society where information is no longer scarce, that's a really interesting framework. Why? You walk into a forest. Do you have any more or less information than you walk into a library? Well, now suddenly, what do you mean by information? Jared Diamond, at the beginning of Guns, Germs, and Steel, walks through a Papua New Guinea forest and notes the immense amount of information that his guide has that he doesn't have access to. It's not in books. It's in the forest. Now, what's going on with us that would leave... Now, when Manson said that, that was a truism that most of us would hear and say, oh, of course, we have so much more information. Do we? Or is it different kinds of information? Is it human information? Is it pre-chewed information? Is it, well, Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. Day after day they pour forth speech. The forest, the rainforest, pours forth speech. It is full of information. What is the difference between the information that is coming at us and when we're walking through a library or going through the supermarket checkout or turning on the television or watching Netflix, and the information that is coming at us when we're in a rainforest? Now, very quickly, well, it's because it's all mediated by humans and we're all trying to colonize each other. And whereas in some ways the rainforest is just kind of there. Or is it saying something? I mean, fascinating, fascinating, fascinating.
Essentially, it's something I still believe, but I think when you live in a society where information is no longer scarce, where there's essentially more stuff for you to consume and understand and learn about than is humanly possible.
More stuff for you to consume. Now, it's really interesting where Peterson in his lectures talks about how the same parts of our brain look for food as look for information. And notice how we're using consume in that way. Isn't that interesting?
The most obvious question becomes, what is worth pursuing? What is worth learning about? What is worth trusting and believing in?
Okay, so we have a salience hierarchy. We have a value hierarchy. And this is where relevance realization, John Vervaeke's term, comes in. Okay, and this is, so Google figured this out a while ago because, well, what it was going to map the internet. Well, how do you map the internet? Now, search is key because it's all available out there, and it's been logified in terms of logos. I mean, Google turns internet noise into logos, and here you have the little search engine. Here it comes, and what search does is sort of, again, there's no less information in the rainforest. And your capacity to take in this information is really only mediated by it. Again, remember the first conversation the first Vancouver one with Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and Brett Weinstein, when Jordan Peterson keeps harping on this a priori structure. Now, the kind of information that he's talking about is already sort of wedded to, set for that structure in a way the rainforest isn't.
I think if you look at previous generations, information was scarce, opportunities were more scarce. And so people had kind of from an early point in their life, a more clear path of what they should be following.
Now, I think one of the things that we should note is the rise of secularization and the decline of formal religion, because basically what religion does is sets out an interpretive filter in order to process all of this information. And, well, maybe you didn't go to church. A little bit later, and quite a bit later in the conversation, well, how did you get into this? Well, we had a dysfunctional family, or let's say a disrupted family. Notice too where natural, so now we sort of have an evolutionary biologist, and the evolutionary biologist is supposed to give us, supposed to feed into the values question by pointing to the rainforest, or pointing to the ape, or pointing to the mammal. Now, that's interesting coming through there because, well, what do values do? Values sort information according to relevance, all right? Values sort information and shape information. There's way too much information in the rainforest for you to perceive, but you have an a priori structure that has been honed for generation after generation, and when you hear the snake, you respond. When you hear the lion or the tiger, you respond. Why? Well, that's your value hierarchy. What's the value? The value is very simple. Stay alive. Well, staying alive now in this human rainforest of information is a whole different thing. So now if you come to the rainforest with a value structure, in a little while they're going to get into religion. Well, of course they're going to get into religion, because in many ways the religious formation that you were supposed to be coded with as a child is supposed to help you navigate this rainforest by sorting it and reducing its complexity into a manageable size.
So people had kind of from an early point in their life a more clear path of what they should be following, and what they should be learning about. And I think today, starting with millennials and even more so with Gen Z, it's, we've grown up with this overabundance of information and opportunity.
Again, you've grown up with a certain type of information that is different from what previous generations grew up with. Everybody, I mean, let's assume the amount of information coming into you is X, and that's limited by what? It's limited by your filters, what you can actually perceive. What has changed is not the amount of information, because again, there's a near infinite amount of information in the rainforest and a near infinite amount of information through your web browser. It's the type of information and I would say the virality of the information in some ways, because what type of spiky proteins are coming through the web browser that, well, you're always developing antibodies to these spiky proteins, right? And so what is a religious system but rather a filter? And so when Sam Harris says, well, supernatural, well, by the Bible, well, there's your filter. And again, when I get into some later chapters in George Marsden's book, these filters were set at the end of the 19th century. That we are still dealing with today.
Opportunity of growing today, starting with millennials and even more so with Gen Z, it's, we've grown up with this overabundance of information and opportunity of life paths to choose for ourselves. And so it kind of, on paper, that sounds like a great thing, and it is a great thing in a lot of ways, but it also kind of invites these existential questions of what is worth pursuing. And I just found that, myself and a lot of my peers and friends kind of went into what most people would call midlife crisis in our 20s. And
you might call it a meaning crisis. They went into it in their 20s. Well, why does usually a midlife crisis happen when you get into your 50s or 60s? What's the cliche about someone my age with a red sports car? I don't know. Can you call my Mazda a sports car? It isn't a Corvette. And chasing younger women is because they face mortality. Now, it's interesting because you're going to get into Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death, which Peterson talks about quite a bit. And Peterson likes the book, but again says, well, he's a little too, he sort of pins everything on death, and that's not quite right. And I think Peterson's right on that. It isn't quite right. But why are people having these crises now in their 20s instead of in their 50s? Well, maybe a midlife crisis happened in your 50s in modernity because it was there that suddenly some of the deep meaning and value questions in earlier secularity were engaged. Now you're getting it right in your 20s, partly because many of those people in the 1960s that bought that red sports car when they were 50 or 60 years old, they had been at least raised with not less information, but less virus-laden information, and they also had been raised with a certain degree of antibodies. And this young generation is not being raised with those antibodies, and so suddenly, well, now you've got all the ingredients for a meaning crisis.
And for me, writing Subtle Art was kind of writing my way out of that. It was, as you said, investigating these value structures, going back to the philosophy.
Now, I'm not sure what Subtle Art is. Is that his blog, or is that what became the book? I don't know. I'll have to do a little bit more research on that if he continues to hold my interest. But again,
was, and for me, writing Subtle Art was kind of writing my way out of that. It was, as you said, investigating these value structures, going back to the philosophers and trying to understand, what their ideas around these things were. And,
again, back to the philosophers. Well, why the philosophers? Well, love of wisdom.
And it's, for me, it kind of, you asked me, your original question was, what did it do for me? For me, it gave me a sense of, sense that I understood where I was, I guess.
Watch Jonathan Peugeot talk to Rationality Rules. Jonathan had this little spree of talking to, talk to Adam, and Peugeot keeps saying, you need to know where you are. You need to know where you are. Well, I'm sitting at 95822 in Sacramento, California. No, that's not where. Well, what do you mean where? What do you mean information? Now, I need to know where I am. Where in what? In time and space? No, I know that. Where is this where that you're trying to locate yourself within, that you need philosophers and a value structure and a mediating structure and an a priori structure? Where is this where?
I guess it helped me since that I understood where I was, I guess. I guess it helped me create like a map.
A map of meaning?
Of how to navigate my life. And so with Subtle Art, it was kind of, I wanted to provide the right questions for a layperson, somebody who's not going to go read Nietzsche, or somebody who's not going to study existentialism, to ask the right questions that will kind of help them do the same thing.
Okay, the questions are going to filter everything that's coming at him.
In a more basic way.
How do you talk about the average person in your book? To you, what does the average person look like?
That's a great question.
Are you the average person?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, I agree.
That's a great question that Jordan probably wouldn't have asked. But Mikhaila is there to ask it, and she makes this interview better. Okay, she really does, and I know that there's some drama around this in terms of the Jordan Peterson fandom, but she makes this interview better. It's better for her here. Well, it's on her podcast, actually, technically. So,
yeah. I think the average person does not have the time or the interest for a lot of these questions, yet they still struggle with them.
Okay.
Does not have the time or the interest. That's interesting, because actually they are using their time and they do have interest, but that's really interesting. It might be better to say that the time and the understanding comes through what the people do, perhaps analogous to let's say the homeless person that doesn't have the official prescribed medication for their bipolar or their depression or their schizophrenia, and they treat it with street drugs and alcohol. It's not that these issues go away. We just deal with them in different ways. That's more of what we're talking about here.
I think the average person does not have the time or the interest for a lot of these questions, yet they still struggle with them.
And it was exactly in this way that religions and church basically dealt with these things. Philosophy is sort of this other level for really smart people. And whether or not it's actually in an organized religion, we would say that it's usually folk religion. And, well, folk religion is sort of what self-help is. And a little bit later, he'll make the comment that, well, about 55% of his book readers are women, which is low in self-help. And for Peterson, of course, it's inverse. He has a little bit more men than women, and they'll talk about that a little bit later in the interview. But see, what we're dealing with here is, well, how do we filter the world? How do we organize the world? How do we have a value hierarchy? It's going to manifest itself in a value hierarchy. How do we manage these things? Well, this is exactly what religion did, even if you didn't call it a religion, even if nobody recognized it as a religion. Supernatural, natural, doesn't really matter. That's actually a better definition of religion than, well, supernatural and Bible. No, that's not really what we're dealing with here.
Okay. I think the average person has a generic middle-class job, maybe partially college educated, but not always, and feels these things. They feel.
Now, this is actually a really important question, because average, what is average? Just go out there on the internet and look for, if you break the world down into 100 people, well, we're not talking about the world. Well, who are we talking about? Well, we're talking about people who might read a self-help book, and what percentage of them have finished some college. And he's basically just sort of guessing about the people in his life and the people he's seen on the news, and we all do this, but it really is a good question. It's an important question.
Feel kind of the social fabric unwinding underneath them.
Probably the people he went to high school with, just went to a class reunion, and these were the basically hot takes he had about what normal people are, at least in America.
They see things on social media and on the news that is confusing and upsetting, but they don't have the time. They haven't had the time to investigate these things further. And so those are kind of one way I think of, you started this off asking, Mikhaila, you said you didn't identify with my work as much as
13 million
most other people. Yeah. I mean, one way I think about it.
It's also important to remember that 13 million, the United States has 330 million people. California has 35, pushing 40 million people. Canada has less people than that. Australia has around 25 million people. UK has around 60 million people. So 13 million people is a really big number. And if you're a blogger and you wrote a book that sold 13 million copies, you are way up there on Peterson's Pareto distribution. But on the great scheme of things in terms of the world, 13 million, it's nothing. More people than that now have probably received COVID vaccinations.
It is, I'm asking many similar questions or bringing up a lot of similar points to your dad, but I think I'm translating it down further.
Yeah.
It's more organized and packaged for mass consumption.
And he didn't trigger the antibodies of the culture of one side of the culture war like Jordan Peterson did.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that was a solid answer, actually. That was good. Okay, and then this is just a simple question. Well, maybe. What do you mean? Like, what are you supposed to give a fuck about, according to you? Is it different for each person, or are there rules people can kind of follow to figure it out?
I intentionally don't answer that question because I don't feel it's right for me to impose my values on any of my readers. I do simply, at times in the book, I offer kind of what I've
just wait for it.
Discovered is better or worse to give a fuck about for myself. And I do provide...
I'm going to harass you about that in a minute or two. So I thought I'd warn you about that. So you can prepare.
Thanks for the warning.
Yeah, no problem.
My favorite moment of the entire podcast. He's saying this, I thought, oh, it's like, you know, the rookie pitcher comes in and you've got the home run superstar and he lays that fastball with not enough stuff on it right down the middle of the plate, and Jordan's like, oh, I'm gonna lay into this one.
I do lay out, I think, some principles that I generally, I think, find to be useful, you know, so generally it's more useful to focus on kind of what it's not the most sophisticated terms, but internal values versus external values, you know, so focus on things that occur inside of you, focus on your own integrity, focus on your own honesty. These are things that you experience internally versus, say,
now, the degree to which this internal-external definition works is probably not too different from the degree to which natural-supernatural works.
You know, things that you experience externally, external markers of validation.
What would that be? Like fame? Is that an example you
Money,
used?
Yeah. So money, social media followers, things like that, having a nice car. You know, there's nothing wrong with those, but it's similar to the discussion we were having earlier. Like we all like money, we all like having nice things, but there needs to be, you can't only value those things. Like you have to have a balance of kind of more internally driven things that you care about.
So I do think that you impose your values on your readers, but I actually think, well, okay,
And Mikhaila, I love it. I love it. I first listened to this a couple of times, and then watching it, it's just way more fun.
I'm going to think that
things that
your readers, but I actually think, well,
Mikhaila saw that coming. She's like, oh, slow, too slow fastball moving down the middle of the plate. He is about to tee off, and this guy knows it too.
Okay, I'm going to make two observations. The first is that I think that apologizing for that is the most predictable thing that a millennial could possibly do. Because I think your generation, and perhaps even more the generation younger than you, what they've been taught above all else is that the cardinal moral sin is to judge, to be judgmental, right? To be discriminating.
Watch My Name is Earl, White Lie Christmas. It is the perfect story about this. And those of you who have watched my videos long enough know that switched. This is the turning of the page on wokeness. Turn the page on this, because my name is Earl, white lie Christmas, don't judge me. That was up at the top of the hierarchy. And now the strange persistence of guilt. David Brooks links to, I forget, the Wilfred McClay, is that his name? That article that I've read a number of times. It's all right there.
But that's absolutely foolish. And you actually make a case for that, because you say that one of the most important things that you can do, and by you mean you, but you also mean other people, is to say no. And that as soon as you value one thing, which you need to do, and hopefully the proper thing, you're saying no to a very large number of other things. And so this is why the stance of the idea that you can raise being non-judgmental to the level of a higher moral virtue is definitely wrong. If your claim is correct, that your emotional state depends on your value structure, and it's more important than anything else to get your value structure straight, and if you have a value structure, you have to say yes to some things and no to others, then you immediately admit that there's a value hierarchy, and there's some things at the top and some things at the bottom. And I think one of the real strengths of your book is that you at least begin to do that. And I think you do it explicitly. So you say quite straightforwardly that there are 5 things that you've discovered that are of general utility, that you've found of general utility. And you don't say that you're certain that you're 100% right about those 5 things. But you certainly make the claim that the reader should take them seriously and that they've been useful to you. And that was taking responsibility. And you do a very careful job of distinguishing that from accepting universal fault, which is a good piece of intellectual exercise, because it's necessary to take responsibility and to discriminate that from assuming universal fault. You can get cancer, and it's not necessarily your fault. In fact, it probably isn't. But you still have to take responsibility for it, or suffer the consequences. You talk about the necessity to accept and cultivate the ability to tolerate, to accept uncertainty and to cultivate the ability to tolerate it. You talk about learning to appreciate failure. You talk about rejection, we already mentioned that, and the ability to say no, and the necessity of saying no. And
take your medicine.
Perhaps the unapologetic necessity of saying no. And you also, you make that concrete in some sense, because you talk about, for example, that you learned as you transitioned from your 20s to your 30s that saying no to an entire smorgasbord, let's say, of sexual possibilities was worthwhile because you found something deeper in the commitment to a single person. And that's a form of sacrifice. You talk about sacrifice in your second book. And you made a sacrifice, and sacrifices are actually worthwhile. And then you talk about contemplation of your own mortality as a way of discriminating between what's important and what isn't. And then in your second book, you talk about both Nietzsche and Kant in some detail, and both of them were striving for the apprehension of something approximating a universal morality. And so I can see that. Yep. And you also mention Ernest Becker, Becker believed that...
All right, you got me.
Well,
gotcha! Everybody's having a good time. And Manson knew it. Manson had to know this was coming. And Dr. Peterson, Professor Jordan Peterson, time to mark up the books and say, hey, wait a minute. It was all good.
Say to that. Yeah.
You got me. Well, you totally, no, you are right. It's funny because, so now I'm kind of.
And from here on in, the interview just gets better and better, actually.
Doing like a check of my, because you are right. You are correct. I think, and I'm going to admit here, I gave you guys the stock answer there,
that's a dangerous thing to do.
I know, well, especially with you guys, but I've been asked a million times, people are like, oh, so what should we give a fuck about? And my de facto answer has always been like, well, it's not my place to tell people exactly what their values should
that's
be.
Definitely
and I do.
Bullshit. That's definitely not true. That's exactly what you're trying to do. Now,
well, and 13 million people are listening.
I think the reason you get away with it is because you're trying to do it for yourself too. You're not preaching.
And you're kind of inferring, right? You say
you're not preaching. You're not a lying preacher.
This is what worked for me, but it could work for you.
Right.
Yeah. And let me present some context to this, which I think can be helpful. My background is straight up just the self-help world. And generally in the self-help world, values are just shoved down your throat. You're supposed to want.
And right here we have the truth about the self-help world, that, well, it's a religious world. It's folk religions, and you just shove the values right down the throat. And Manson knows it, and the Peterson and Jordan knows it, and this is great.
Then the fancy car you're supposed to throw. You're supposedly in the self-help world, values are just shoved down your throat. You're supposed to want the fancy car, you're supposed to want the perfect marriage, you're supposed to want to be happy and live happily ever after. It's like these are the things that
these are the Babylonian image. It's right there.
Are taken for granted at page 1. And so, when I wrote Subtle Art, I went through pains to kind of be contrarian in a lot of ways to what a typical self-help book is. And so,
oh, that's the title of his book. How could I be so dense? It's the one word that comes up salient, and the rest of the subtle art but that's for him what it is.
One of those ways was, I don't want to explicitly ram values down people's throats, but I agree with you that
we're not going to ram values down people's throats in our prescription drug ads. We're gonna sneak it in, and you're not even gonna know you're getting it. That's religion, atheism. We're just gonna sneak it right in under the radar. That's the way you do it.
Overarching project of the book is, yes, I am imposing, even if I don't come out and say it, like, this is what you should give a fuck about. It's the way I've constructed the book. And
tell the truth, or at least don't lie.
Particularly the second book. The second book is much more striving for some sort of solid structure.
Right,
to believe
that's
in.
this book, by the way.
Yeah.
Just so everybody knows. Well, you hooked yourself into this project as soon as you made that initial discovery. Like, you made quite a profound discovery, in my estimation, which was that values regulate emotion.
Yeah.
So then as soon as you make that discovery, you're stuck with a question, which is, okay, then what are the appropriate values
that make me happy?
Well, or even, well, if it's not happy, it's some other metric, because you could also question.
And this, again, Mikhaila makes this better. If this had been Jordan one-on-one with Mark, it would not have been so good.
Whether or not happy is the right ultimate value.
I like happiness. I know you're like, it's not about being happy.
And this is where the father-daughter dynamic is really precious. And it's really good because, especially given their story, she can say things to him. I mean, family members are, it's so intricate what they will and won't say, but she can stand up to him and he can take it from her. And, this gets into a lot of what Jordan built this system to do. And so right here, I love this part of the video because, before we're everything's coming directly on. That's the information that we're all being bombarded with. Now we're getting the rainforest information. Now we're watching the two. Now we're getting the bearing witness and the modeling and all of those type things. This is really gold right here.
Happy.
Right. Not happy.
That make me happy.
With a question, which is, okay, then what are the appropriate values?
That make me happy.
Well, or even.
No, not kind of.
Well, if it's not happy, it's some other metric. You know, because you could also question whether...
And watch, she slumps the shoulders like, oh, Dad, you know, this is gold right here.
You're not happy is the right ultimate value.
I like happiness. I know you're like, it's not about being happy, but...
Well, it beats the hell out of being miserable.
Yes,
if happiness comes along, you should be bloody happy that it's like lit on your stem for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gold, my friends. It's gold.
But it's, and then as soon as you get into that question, it's turtles all the way down, right? Like it's, that takes you into.
That's I think turtles all the way down is sort of a meaning crisis tell. Because we can't answer these questions. Well, it's not functionally different than the supernatural. It's we're swimming here in parabolic knowledge. That's the best we got.
You know, kind of staring into the void, so to speak, which you talk about in your work quite a bit of you know, how you have to take on the responsibility to create something that's meaningful in your life.
Yes, or to discover it. That's one of the weaknesses.
Creator discovered. Now we're back into Nietzsche.
Of Nietzsche, I think. I mean, I'm a great admirer of Nietzsche, and I've never read anyone who could think with as much glittering brilliance as Nietzsche, and he's very dangerous to times with a sentence, or in some sense. I mean,
again, to a lot of his teaching mode or his repeating, and a bunch of you have seen this, so I'm fast forwarding. And if you say, oh, don't fast forward, watch the whole video. Watch it a few times. It's okay. It's free. It's on YouTube. Might have to deal with some ads, but you'll live. Get an ad blocker. Get a premium account.
He never sold any books, and what it takes other people an entire book, and that actually happens to be true. Nietzsche could, in fact, do that. And he believed that we could create our own values, but that's wrong. We can't create our own values. We can discover them, and we can co-create them, but, you know...
right there. We can co-create. What do you mean? In a community, because that's where... That's actually where you can, if you have a community, for better or for worse, you can create an environment where values will be reinforced and established. But that community is nested in other communities, and it's exactly this filter that religious development and is intended to reproduce and give its people.
Oh, and you know this in your book as well. It comes out again implicitly. You wouldn't be able to violate your conscience if you could create your own values. Right?
Violate your conscience?
Yeah. I love it. I love it. I love that Mikhaila is in this conversation and they're talking to each other. This is gold. This is gold.
Yeah, because your conscience, you'll
lower this for me a little bit.
You'll do something that your conscience objects to.
Okay.
Okay. And if you were fully capable of creating your own values, your conscience would never object. You would just go along with what you'd proposed. Like if we were the sorts of creatures that could do that. But what we find very rapidly is we try very hard to impose our own values. And then it fails. We're not satisfied by what we're pursuing, or we become extremely guilty, or we become ashamed, or we're hurt, or we hurt other people. And sometimes that doesn't mean we're wrong, but most often it does. And so your search for bedrock, I think, is, and perhaps
turtles.
The fact that you never do come to any final conclusion is definitely, at least in my opinion, so maybe not definitely, but in my opinion, a large part of the reason why your books are attractive. You know, the millennials, you talk about the consumer literature that shows that people who have an infinite variety of choices are less happy than people who only have one or two. And you mentioned at the beginning of this discussion that the millennial generation that you're a part of suffered in some sense because they weren't deprived enough and had too many choices.
Okay. So before, when we talked about the rainforest and this information glut, what are we really talking about with this information glut? We're really talking about this, well, does the rainforest have any fewer choices than the world we're in? Well, what's holding us in the world? Because again, one of Peterson's great illustrations is there are near infinite ways to make it through a cornfield. Well, make it through a rainforest too. There's more impinging things. And again, you get into Vervaeke stuff, and it's all about these things that bind us and reduce our choices. And what's going on in this world now? It's that, no, you can have this or this or this. It's all pre-chewed. It's pre-filtered. It's different from the natural order. Well, in what way?
The advantage to being deprived is that it's obvious what to do. Like if you're starving, then you eat. Yeah. There's no question. But if you have enough to eat and you have enough shelter and you have enough information, maybe not as much as you could have, but enough, it starts to become difficult to decide what to do. And then you have another problem, which is that you can't decide what to do. Yeah. And then you have to start to investigate value. And that seems to me...
Because that's where because the value impinges on the near infinite amount of information, whether it be rainforest information or human civilization information. The value impinges on it, narrows it down, and the rainforest says, find food, or find potable water, or make a shelter, or run from the snake, or it's very, but now it's, well, we're behind all of these layers of civilization, and, it's very complex because it's all human mediated.
Even from your autobiographical comments, seem to be what happened with you and obviously so many other people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that plays into kind of what we were talking about, the kind of the radical subcultures that exist and percolate online. I feel like a lot of people are going through these existential malaise and they're searching. And so they're just scrolling through social media and they find something that piques their interest, seems counterintuitive or exciting, and suddenly they're kind of whisked down this rabbit hole without much awareness of what's happening.
One of the reasons that I'm a rather staunch admirer of traditional Christianity, say even in its Catholic form, let's say, which is the most traditional form, arguably.
The Orthodox are gonna come after you, Jordan.
Is that I think that Catholicism is as sane as people can get.
Now watch Mikhaila.
Like
weren't there areas of Catholicism that were a little out there?
There still are. I mean,
out there. Remember earlier, I needed to figure out where I was out there. Again, all these spatial metaphors. It's the exaptation. This is us adapting to all of these things.
Doctrine is very difficult to understand. The idea of the virgin birth, for example, and all of the strange irrationality that goes along with a religious belief. But the problem is that the
strange irrationality that goes along with a religious belief. Why does it feel strange and irrational? Because you're dealing at this filter level. You're dealing at this values level.
We need something structured and irrational to protect us from even less structured and more irrational beliefs. That's my sense of it. We can't live in a fully rational world because we're not smart enough. We need something to fill in the gaps. And the advantage of a codified religion is at least that there's a unifying force behind it. And what you get now is this fragmentation and search for replacement for religious values. And there's not much difference. Well, a conspiratorial theory will offer exactly that. But none of...
A conspiratorial theory is a filter through which you filter the information. And so look at that with the politics. Both sides have their conspiratorial theories through which they filter their information.
The true benefits of a religious system, one that's evolved over time and that has a deep basis.
Well, Mark, did you argue that some of the values you kind of inferred could potentially replace that?
Are we looking for a new religion? Brett Weinstein and Alistair McGrath. Are we looking for a religion that's not a religion? Are we looking for... It's the same game.
The religious values, you mean? Or... Well, one of the concerns I raise in Everything is Fucked is that is what Jordan just said, which is, I think people, in lieu of religion, they are taking worldly values, things like politics.
There's someone that's been shaped by evangelical culture. They're taking worldly values, secular values. Boy, that word is just a tell.
Cultural issues, social group identities, and behaving religiously around them, adopting kind of religious belief systems around them. And that
both Petersons kind of put their head down and say, yeah, we've been on the other end of that one.
It's extremely concerning to me. I mean, you don't have to read far back in history to see how that ends up bad.
See, an organized religion, this is something that Carl Jung really recognized, and he was an astute critic of Nietzsche and also an admirer of Nietzsche, is that we do have a profound religious impulse. And that I'm not saying that that's good or that it's bad. I'm saying that something has to be done with it. And the advantage to a genuine religion is that it's very, very complicated.
Well, the alternatives don't seem great.
Yes, yes.
It's got...
I love that. If Peterson goes to it's complicated thing, and Mikhaila's like, how many times have I heard this little speech? And she just sums it right up. Just a great little summary. Just bang. Well, the alternatives aren't great. On we go with the conversation. Again, Mikhaila makes this a better conversation.
It's been back-tested for 2,000 years.
Well, and there's some...
And he comes with the Darwinian Jordan Peterson. So Jordan has obviously thoroughly, deeply impacted Mikhaila, but also Manson.
Something at the core of it, there's an ideal. Like in Christianity, there's The idea of the ideal human being, that's Christ, whose mode of being offers redemption.
You had a miserable time, though.
Well,
I mean, right there, Jesus Christ is the ideal human being. He started out this thing talking about, well, self-help books just kind of, the good car and the big income and the nice house and the good love life and the good and well-behaved children and all of this stuff. And, well, at the center of this is Jesus Christ, who, as Mikhaila just said, well, you're gonna pick him. And of course, the last temptation of Christ, why wouldn't Jesus look like Thor? Why wouldn't Jesus look like Tony Stark? Why wouldn't Jesus look like Captain America? I like my saviors uncrucified. This is gold, my friends.
Well, people whose the idea of the ideal human being, that's Christ, whose mode of being offers redemption.
You had a miserable time, though.
Well, people do have a miserable time, though.
Look at them! Look at them! Look at them! It's great. And Mikhaila's being a daughter, and Jordan's being a father, and Jordan's just been through hell and back, and Mikhaila escorted him and cared for him, and this is too good. And Manson's snickering in the background. It's too much fun to watch.
And that's one of the things that makes it powerful.
Back to the happiness thing. Back to the happiness.
So there's a striving there to specify what that ideal constitutes. And this is something that Ernest Becker got wrong too, as far as I'm concerned. So Becker believed that our attempts to weave together a heroic narrative were motivated by our denial of death. And that's true, but it's not true enough, because what Becker didn't understand or didn't realize, and I liked The Denial of Death, I thought it was a great book, was that a lot of our heroic projects actually stave off death as well. So they may have the symbolic value of providing us with symbolic immortality, but they have the practical value of us not dying. And so if you adopt
Yeah.
a mode of life that is practical, it gives you a sense of meaning, but that's not because that's somehow papering over your fear of death. It's because it actually provides you with a meaningful way of being in a world that's rife with uncertainty and mortality. You can't write that all off as psychological. And that comes through in your book, the fact that you know that. Like, one thing I'm really curious about, this commitment issue that you raised, because it seemed to me, and I might be wrong, but tell me if I'm barking up the wrong tree. It seemed to me that it was quite a revelation to you that being in a committed monogamous relationship would bring you as much satisfaction and happiness as it did compared to a more libertine lifestyle. So is that a reasonable observation?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Huge epiphany.
Okay, so two questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first is, what did you discover that you didn't know? You know, what is it that being in a committed relationship did for you that you didn't realize it might do beforehand?
So there's
I'll just leave that with you as a teaser, because off they go in that, and it's great. Watch the whole thing. It's fun that they've sort of broken the 1 hour mark, and we're doing things more of an hour and a half or up to 2 hours, which is sort of, I think, a better time frame. But yeah, it's all right there. So what gets interesting in this is because American atheists continue to critique Christianity with its own value system, a point that's been made again and again and again and again. And they might denounce religion, not seeing that religion is actually everywhere. It's simply mediated by different structures. It's simply gone underground, and, well, we have different churches and different preachers, and not only in terms of the national political, but also in terms of the self-help, which in some ways has become the new folk religion. And it's all there. It's just we don't see it. We don't see it. So watch the whole video. The whole video is really terrific. And yeah, I'll probably have something to say about Peterson and Ridley's video. So thanks for watching.